Well, our breaking news tonight from the Washington Post is that the Post is reporting that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, quote, ordered an operation to lure Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi back to Saudi Arabia from his home in Virginia and then detain him, according to U.S. intelligence intercepts of Saudi officials discussing the plan. The U.S. intelligence intercepts of the Saudi officials' plan raised the question of whether the Trump administration was obligated to warn Jamal Khashoggi that he was in danger from the Saudi regime. There is no doubt now just how much danger Khashoggi faced. He entered the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, in Turkey, last week, and he never came out. He has not been seen since. Jamal Khashoggi is a Saudi Arabian dissident who has been living in the United States in a self-imposed exile and writing opinion columns for the Washington Post. He has applied for U.S. citizenship and was visiting Turkey last week in order to prepare all the necessary paperwork for his upcoming marriage to his fiancée, who lives in Istanbul. They plan to be married and split their time between Washington and Istanbul. Jamal Khashoggi needed some Saudi documents for his upcoming marriage, and so he made an appointment to visit the Saudi consulate in Istanbul on October 2nd. His fiancée waited outside the consulate when he went inside. They were going to go shopping for appliances for their new home after what they thought would be a short visit to the consulate. After 3 hours, with no sign of Jamal Khashoggi leaving the consulate, his fiancée got worried and checked with some people inside who told her that he left already and she must have missed him, which would mean standing there outside the consulate, waiting there anxiously for her fiancé to come out. She simply missed him walking out the door. And for some reason, he decided to walk right past her. He has been missing ever since, and there is now a report from unnamed Turkish officials saying that he was murdered in that consulate by a team of 15 Saudis who flew to Istanbul on 2 different private planes. A video camera recorded Khashoggi entering the consulate at 1:14 p.m., but there is no video of him exiting the consulate. This is the kind of thing that any past president of the United States would be actively pressuring Saudi Arabia on, but Donald Trump's son-in-law has a new best friend in Saudi Arabia, the Jared Kushner of Saudi Arabia, the 33-year-old Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Like all dictators around the world who have heard the president of the United States call the press the enemy of the people, the Saudi dictatorial regime, of course, believes that such enemies of the people should be executed. And as far as they can tell, the President of the United States has absolutely no objection to that. Tonight, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee has sent a letter to the President, signed by every member of the committee, except, of course, Ron Paul, demanding an investigation of the disappearance and possible murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Joining our discussion now, Ned Price, former senior director and spokesperson for the National Security Council in the Obama administration and former CIA analyst, and Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for The Washington Post and host of WNYC Radio's America on the Line. They are both MSNBC contributors. And Ned, your reaction to this latest reporting from The Washington Post saying that American intelligence intercepts have captured Saudi officials discussing a plan to detain Khashoggi?
Well, in some ways, Lawrence, this underscores our worst fear. In the intelligence community, there's something known as Intelligence Community Directive 191, and it requires that the intelligence community provide, as you said, a duty to warn to both U.S. citizens and non-U.S. citizens alike in 3 scenarios: in the threat of murder, in the threat of bodily harm, and in the threat of, yes, kidnapping. So the fact that Jamal Khashoggi entered the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey, seemingly unafraid, seemingly unconcerned with his own safety, suggests that did not happen. I can tell you, when I was at CIA, that was pretty automatic, this provision of duty to warn to potential victims of such crimes. In this case, if that did not happen, it raises profound questions. And I think a lot of those questions center on this administration's extraordinarily close, if not airtight, relationship with Saudi Arabia that has centered around Jared Kushner. It reminds me of reporting we saw earlier this year, Lawrence, that Jared, in his travel, in his discussions with the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman late last year, provided the Crown Prince with U.S. intelligence about targets for a forthcoming Saudi purge that was then carried out a week after Jared left Saudi Arabia. If Jared was willing to provide intelligence to the Saudi Crown Prince, I think we have reason at least to be suspicious of the possibility that the administration prohibited the intelligence community from fulfilling its solemn duty in this case.
And Jonathan, this is a Washington Post story. This is one of the people who works, has a relationship with your newspaper, an opinion writer for your newspaper. What has the Post been able to do?
The Post has been able to, at least as an institution, raise hell in all quarters where we can raise hell, whether it's to the administration, the Saudis, the Turks, anyone who will listen, because... And
this is normally a thing where the Washington Post would have a receptive ear at the State Department and at the White House.
Right. And in fact, you wouldn't have to demand that the President of the United States say something, that the administration would say something about not just the disappearance and possible murder of someone who is living in the United States, but also a journalist. Freedom is like the bedrock of American democracy. Freedom of the press is essential. Journalism is the only profession protected in the Constitution. We are a beacon for other nations around the world because of freedom of the press. So the governed willing to be held accountable, the governing being willing to be held accountable by the people through the press. And the fact that a journalist, an opinion writer for a major American newspaper has gone missing and possibly murdered, and there is relative silence from the President of the United States and the administration, is chilling. And you know, the fact that we're talking about Jamal Khashoggi should remind everyone about the perils of being a journalist. As Americans, we're not used to this. Journalists cover stories and cover politicians and cover the powerful all the time. And the fact that we're talking about Jamal Khashoggi right now shows that the perils of holding the powerful accountable.
And he's not the only one. I want to raise another issue here, because the president has talked about the press as being the enemy of the people. And we've been saying how that must sound to other countries around the world, especially the more dictatorial regimes. And Shahidul Alam is being held by Bangladeshi authorities who grabbed him in August. He's still in detention. He has been jailed now for several weeks, and he's a photographer there. There are British protests trying to bring attention to his case. But Ned, this is one of the things that we have seen. We've actually been kind of anticipating. What are these kinds of countries with these sort of police state apparatuses are going to do in an atmosphere where Donald Trump unleashes this license that these people are the enemy of the people?
Well, that's right, Lawrence. As Americans, we like to brag and to crow that our president is the leader of the free world. He's an object of emulation and a source of inspiration. But in this case, he is playing that role for some of the most egregious despots around the world. And we've seen the results of that before our very eyes and in public. Look at Bashar al-Assad. He has used the term fake news within his own country, within his own context. Viktor Orban, the increasingly autocratic leader of Hungary, has called the main Hungarian opposition paper a fake news factory. The Kremlin, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has a site dedicated on its website where it takes primarily Western press reports and puts a big red fake label on top of them. These countries and these leaders are emulating President Trump, and they see that he is giving him and them license. It's not only his rhetoric, Lawrence, but it's also his failure to act. It's his failure to act to call out civil rights and civil liberties and human rights around the globe, just as he cozies up with autocrats and despots. Just look at Kim Jong-un. Just look at his love fest with Duterte, with El-Sisi of Egypt, and the list goes on, and we end with Mohammed bin Salman. Perhaps there's no greater friend of Jared Kushner and Donald Trump than Mohammed bin Salman, who, according to this Washington Post piece, may be behind what sounds like it could be an egregious and horrific crime.
And Jonathan Capehart, if there is to be the kind of investigation that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is demanding, it may well be that the name Jared Kushner comes up in that investigation because Jared Kushner has had phone calls with the Crown Prince that are not monitored, that are not, that don't go through the normal security checks, and there may be some discoveries there that could be very uncomfortable for Jared Kushner.
Right. That's assuming the administration goes along, assuming the administration hands over the information that's needed to carry out a real investigation. Up until this moment, Republicans on Capitol Hill have been unbelievably compliant with any of the wishes from the administration. It would be very interesting to see how the administration responds to this. And one other thing, there are two reporters from Reuters who were arrested in Myanmar, who have been in jail for 303 days since December of 2017. So journalists are being arrested around the world. This case of Jamal Khashoggi hits close to home because he was a global opinions writer at the Washington Post.
Yeah, and just go back to Shahidul Alam. The reason he was arrested in Bangladesh is that he criticized the government's reaction and handling of protests. This is exactly what you would want the media and the press to be able to do in any country. And Ned, this is the kind of thing that they have every right to believe Donald Trump would encourage. Just go ahead, shut these people down if they criticize the government.
Well, that's absolutely right, and in fact, he has. In some cases, it's been explicit, as when he tells Duterte that he loves the way that he's handling the crime problem and the drug problem in his own countries, and in some cases, it's implicit. The fact that the U.S. government does not weigh in when these things happen. Look, Lawrence, it is even broader than freedom of the press and our standing up for human rights and civil liberties around the globe. I think what we've seen is an abdication of leadership from this administration that has given rise to some of the worst impulses of some of the worst regimes around the world. We've talked about the Saudis' potential, even apparent murder of this U.S. resident and Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi, but we can also cite Moscow's use of chemical weapons on British soil. We can talk about a whole number of examples of regimes acting on these worst impulses, to include the Chinese arresting the head of Interpol just in recent days. They do this, I think, at least in part, knowing that they have impunity because America is no longer willing to stand up, is no longer willing to criticize, and is no longer willing to act on the side of human rights and civil liberties and the values that we've always stood for.
And Jonathan Capehart, it's just so heartbreaking to read Khashoggi's fiance's op-ed piece describing standing out there on the sidewalk waiting for him to come out, and now she's pleading with President Trump for his intervention here. That's going to be a tough plea to make to this president.
Yes, because it requires him to feel empathy. And
yes.
Over the last almost 2 years, we have seen time and time again that the president of the United States lacks empathy. The idea that he could possibly be a consoler in chief, potentially, for Jamal Khashoggi's fiancée is something that I can't even contemplate. And while she put this plea in print, and it was important that she put it in print, it is my sincerest hope and prayer that her words are heeded by someone in the administration, someone in that West Wing that can get it through to the President of the United States that, damn it, he should care about this.
Ned Price, Jonathan Capehart, thank you for starting our discussion tonight. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.